Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to the Old South Meeting House for today's program in our Middays at the Meeting House series. Again, my name is Jamie Brody and I am the new Education Director. Today we welcome Neil Miller, a journalism instructor at Tufts University and the author of 5 books, to discuss the history, development, and influence of one of Boston's most notorious and unusual organizations, the Watch and Ward Society. The Watch and Ward Society were Boston's unofficial censors, the city's guardians of morality and order. From the late 1870s to their heyday in the early 20th century, the Watch and Ward Society defined for the city what was acceptable to listen to read, and to view. Their powerful influence forever linked the city to the phrase, "banned in Boston." In the mid to late 1920s, the board of Old South Meeting House was caught in Boston's public battle over freedom of speech and was challenged to define the Meeting House's policy toward free assembly. Since it became a museum in the late 1870s, Old South Meeting House has been used for many public events and assemblies, notably celebrations of historic anniversaries and gatherings for groups like the Daughters of the American Revolution. But the inflammatory issues of the earliest 20th century, birth control, socialism, and racial tensions, concerned many members of the board. Would it lessen the dignity of this patriotic shrine to host controversial mass meetings? Did our desire to remain a place for civic debate require that we give such challenging speakers a forum? Others on the board embraced the Meeting House's revolutionary and radical past. They argue that the Tea Party meetings and other revolutionary events were themselves subversive events and not so different than the proposed meetings and forums of the 1920s. Also, they believed that a society needed a place to air their views or violence would erupt. Freedom of speech was not only a moral imperative, but a practical one, for it helped to restore order. By the late 1920s, Old South Meeting House established that it would open its doors to speakers and programs, regardless of the popularity of the cause. This policy, which inspires our public programming today, sets the standard for our work, that we both value freedom of speech in principle and in practice. Today, it is in the spirit of this mission that we welcome Neil Miller.
Thanks, Jamie, and I'm honored to be here at this august Boston institution. Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, Boccaccio's Decameron, Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy, Sinclair Lewis's Elmer Gantry, all great works of American and world literature and all unavailable in Boston bookstores for many years. Eugene O'Neill's Strange Interlude, Lillian Hellman's The Children's Hour, Sean O'Casey's Within the Gates, all major works of world and American theater, but unable to be performed in Boston. Forever Amber, What Makes Sammy Run, God's Little Acre, huge bestsellers in their time, but banned in Boston. To most of us today, Boston is a pretty liberal city. When we think of censorship, we think of China or Iran or some benighted town south of the Mason-Dixon line, far from an interstate. But for many years, Boston was also the censorship capital of America. And the organization most responsible for censorship in Boston, as Jamie pointed out, particularly the banning of books, was the New England Watch and Ward Society. And in today's talk, I'm going to introduce you to the Watch and Ward and read some bits from my new book, appropriately titled Banned in Boston, to give you some of the flavor of the book. Founded in 1878 and functioning well into the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, the Watch and Ward acted as the city's moral guardian, determining what Bostonians could and could not read, what plays they could and could not see. It raided gambling dens and houses of prostitution, and on occasion even fought political corruption. In its early days, it broke up poker games, even church raffles. It was originally called the New England Society for the Suppression of Vice, changing it to the Watch and Ward in 1891. The name Watch and Ward came from an unofficial police force in Massachusetts Bay Colony that patrolled the byways of Boston from dusk to dawn. And in many respects, that's what the new Watch and Ward was. It was an unofficial police force, in some ways, a group of vigilantes. As an organization, it had no official legal standing, but often it acted with the permission of a judge when local police forces were reluctant or too beholden to corrupt forces to do so. Sometimes it didn't even bother to do that. Now, the Watch and Ward didn't invent censorship in Boston. After all, the Puritans burned the first book in this city back in 1654. Performances of all plays were banned in the city for 50 years, starting in 1750. I bet you didn't know that. The Boston Public Library had a room called the Inferno, which housed books that could only be read for research or scholarly purposes. Among the books consigned to the Inferno were Balzac's Comédie Humaine, Boccaccio's Decameron, and Sir Richard Burton's The Arabian Nights. But if it didn't invent censorship in Boston, the Watch and Ward Society perfected it, made it into an art form. Its blend of gentility, Puritan righteousness, and ruthlessness gave it a particularly Bostonian character. Now, I don't know how ruthless we are, but probably the best summation of the Watch and Ward's views on censorship was given by the Reverend Endicott Peabody, the headmaster of the elite Groton School. And in a speech at the Watch and Ward's annual meeting in 1900, I think some of them were held here, actually, he said, "Put bad books before young people, and the evil things they read stay in their minds and poison their character. I sometimes think that bad books are worse, far worse than bad companions. There is something in the personality of a bad person which repels those not already degraded, and the nature shrinks back from the person, while the book is a perfectly decent-looking thing and steals subtly into the imagination." A number of the early books and plays that the Watch and Ward banned were European, particularly French. Now here's Peabody at another Watch and Ward meeting. "I do not see why these things should be foisted upon us. We do not live as the French live. We do not think as the French think. We do not have the same ideals as they do. When we borrow their plays, we are apt to borrow the very lowest and the very worst." Now, the New England Watch and Ward was an elite organization founded by members of the city's first families, the Boston Brahmins, as they were known. And many of its early leaders were members of the clergy, the mainstream Protestant clergy, I might add, and were involved in the social reform movements of their day. There was Edward Everett Hale, who was a Unitarian minister and the author of the book Man Without a Country, which we had to read in high school. I don't know. There was Phillips Brooks, who was the rector at Trinity Church, who was an anti-slavery activist and one of the most famous preachers in the country. And he was known for speaking 213 words a minute, which was kind of his claim to fame, among other things. In 1886, the Society's vice presidents included the presidents of Dartmouth, Amherst, Brown, Colby, and the University of Vermont, all of them Protestant ministers. Its dues-paying members, most of whom contributed $5, $10, $20, could almost all be found in the Boston Social Register. In the 20th century, its treasurer for 40 years was Godfrey Lowell Cabot, the richest man in Boston, whose Brahmin credentials were impeccable. He was both a Lowell and a Cabot, and as you know, the Lowells only spoke to the Cabots, and the Cabots only spoke to God. So he was a pretty impressive figure. And a real character as well. Anyway, Cabot, as you will discover in my book, had a secret life which went totally against his public image and the image of the Watch and Ward Society, but I can't tell you what that was. You have to read the book. The Watch and Ward was founded at a time, the last 3 decades of the 19th century, when Boston's old families were feeling increasingly that they were losing control of the city. The Massachusetts economy was in decline. It was unable to compete really with the huge corporate structures of the robber barons. The historian Thomas O'Connor probably put it best when he said, "In an age dominated more and more by material forces and secular philosophies, Puritan Christianity's old moral concepts seemed alarmingly out of place. Many of the old Boston families viewed the post-war, meaning post-Civil War, period as completely alien. Traditional moral principles, ethical practices, and cultural standards seem to have completely degenerated." And this sense of alienation on the part of the old families was heightened by the large number of immigrants that were transforming the city: the Irish, Italians, Jews, Eastern Europeans. Political power was passing into the hands of the Irish, and in 1884, Hugh O'Brien became the city's first Irish mayor. And O'Brien did not endear himself to the Brahmin elite when he pronounced Boston to be the most Catholic city in America, or when he closed the Boston Public Library on St. Patrick's Day. And although the Watch and Ward didn't really use overt anti-immigrant rhetoric, there was somewhat of an anti-immigrant tinge to it. And after all, some of the things the Watch and Ward crusaded against were associated with immigrant groups: gambling with the Irish, opium with the Chinese. Now, Boston, we should make it clear, was not the only place where vice crusaders held sway. But in Boston, there was something about censorship in this city that was different. From 1915 to 1927, for example, after the arrests of some booksellers due to Watch and Ward raids, book censorship in Boston was enforced by a deal between the Watch and Ward and the booksellers of Boston called the Gentleman's Agreement. In 1915, J. Frank Chase, who was the Watch and Ward secretary, he was in charge of their day-to-day activities, and Richard Fuller, the president of the old corner bookstore, which used to be right across the street, established something called the Boston Booksellers Committee. It was an unofficial book jury which determined what books would be sold in Boston. And it was composed of 6 people, 3 of them chosen by the bookseller, and 3 by the Watch and Ward directors. And I describe it this way in my book. The committee would read a current novel. If it was acceptable, Boston booksellers could sell it without any fear of court action. If it was deemed actionable, unacceptable, or obscene in the eyes of the committee, all Massachusetts book dealers would be notified by postcard. Anyone selling such a book 48 hours after the notification was subject to Watch and Ward prosecution. At the same time, Boston's newspapers wouldn't advertise or review a condemned title, and the police stayed out of the matter entirely, rarely prosecuting a book on their own. The old corner bookstore's Fuller viewed the system as flawless. If a bookseller won't sell and the reviewer won't review, the book might as well never have been written, said Fuller. Now, critics like H.L. Mencken hated the idea that Chase and Fuller essentially decided what Bostonians could read. That included both books and magazines. It was a literary dictatorship of 6 people operating behind closed doors, and the public in Boston had no idea what was going on. So the first challenge to Watch and Ward hegemony came from H.L. Mencken himself. And Mencken in the 1920s was one of the country's leading intellectual figures. Walter Lippmann called him the most powerful influence on a whole generation of educated people. And it was Mencken who put the first chink in the Watch and Ward's armor after the Watch and Ward attempted to ban his magazine, The American Mercury. Well, they did ban it. But when Mencken sold a copy to Chase on the Boston Common in front of 1,000 people, mostly Harvard students, he was arrested. but then acquitted. And the Watch and Ward, which rarely lost a case, found themselves in a humiliating defeat. And this marked the first moment of the decline in its influence. And those of you who read the excerpt from my book in the Boston Globe magazine in August know that I talk a lot about that particular event. And after this, censorship really ran wild in Boston, with the Suffolk County District Attorney and the Boston Police Superintendent kind of willy-nilly banning books on their own. And that began, and censorship became much stricter than even under the Watch and Ward. And the first book to go was Sinclair Lewis's Elmer Gantry, which, as many of you know, is a satiric portrait of an unscrupulous evangelist. And that was banned by the district attorney, William J. Foley. And the next to go was Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy. And then Foley capped it off by announcing the end of the Gentleman's Agreement. And other books that disappeared from the shelf were novels by Hemingway, Faulkner, John Dos Passos, Sherwood Anderson. Sure enough, as the phrase "banned in Boston" gained national notoriety, various writers and publishers began to discover that being banned in Boston actually increased their sales around the country. So Upton Sinclair, the novelist and muckraker, you know, remember he wrote The Jungle, which was his expose of the meatpacking business, right? He'd just written a book called Oil as a novel, and it was selling rather poorly. And Oil actually was made into a movie a few years ago, which you might remember, called There Will Be Blood. It was nominated for an Academy Award. Remember that? Should have won that one. So he joked with a friend whose book had been banned in Boston, asking him to use his connections with the local censors to get Oil banned as well. Sure enough, Sinclair got his wish. And on June 4th, 1927, a bookseller sold Sinclair's book to two police detectives, and that was that. And I'll sort of read some of that from my book. It starts off, then on May 31st came the suppression of Upton Sinclair's novel Oil, a panoramic look at the corruption of the California oil boom of the 1920s. The police had objected to 9 pages of the text, in which the book's protagonist, a young and naive heir to an oil fortune, is seduced by a young woman, attends a petting party, and is educated about a new ethical code that includes information about contraception. Okay, so this happens, but the circus really begins in earnest when Upton Sinclair arrived in Boston by train from California. Sinclair was determined to get arrested in the Mencken manner, all the more to gain publicity for his book. But the authorities were not as obliging as he hoped. They had learned from the antics of the past. Even before arriving in Boston, Sinclair had tried to get his name substituted for the bookseller on the indictment, but the judge wouldn't hear of it. Then at a June 12th rally at the Boston Common, where Sinclair defended his book before a crowd that grew from 25 to 2,000, the muckraker practically begged the police to take him into custody. Are you going to arrest me? He asked a police officer who broke up the rally, demanding various permits. "We will if you start any funny business," replied the officer. "I wish you would," retorted Sinclair. "I would consider it the greatest privilege ever accorded me. And if it wasn't for the fact that I might be charged with bribery, I would gladly offer you $1,000 to place me under arrest." The officer would not oblige. Still, Sinclair left the rally with a big smile on his face. The author then went to visit Police Superintendent Crowley. The superintendent had personally told Sinclair's lawyer that the book was the worst of the lot, and if he sold a copy in Boston, he would personally appear to prosecute him. Sinclair engaged in a colloquy with Crowley that, according to Sinclair, if you want to believe his account, went like this. Surely, Mr. Crowley, you can't be very familiar with standard literature. Shakespeare, for example. You don't find any of those bedroom scenes in Shakespeare. Have you ever happened to read Cymbeline, Mr. Crowley? Oh, now, of course, you can put it over me in an argument about books, but there's terrible things in that book of yours, Mr. Sinclair. What, for example? Ain't that the book where a girl says she can have a lover because her mother has one and she knows it? Well, yes, that's in there. Well, now, is that the kind of thing to be putting into a book? It happens to be a real case, Mr. Crowley. I knew the people. Well, there might be some people, I don't deny, but that's no reason for spreading the story. Such things destroy the reverence that young girls ought to feel for their mothers. And such things ought to be hushed up, not put into books for young girls to read. The following day, at another rally, Sinclair convinced a police officer to buy a copy of Oil, but it turned out to be a copy of the Bible with the oil dust jacket on it. At one public meeting, Sinclair read Act 3, Scene 2 of Hamlet, which contained what he called indubitably obscene language, and invited the police to buy the book. They refused. He also read them passages from Genesis, featuring the story of Lot and his daughters. The police wouldn't take that bait either. The only way to fight the Massachusetts law is to make a monkey of it, said Sinclair, and clearly that was what he was trying to do. Next, he paraded on the Boston Common. This does end soon. Next, he paraded on the Boston Common carrying a sandwich board in the shape of a fig leaf, promoting Oil, fig leaf edition, warranted 100% pure under Boston law. He had persuaded his publisher to print up 150 copies of the book, in which a black leaf silhouette was substituted for the 9 offending pages that the judge had banned. And finally, on June 21st, he got his wish. Lieutenant Daniel J. Hines, who had bought a copy of An American Tragedy from his publisher 2 months earlier, purchased a book of the real Oil from Sinclair, this time without the fig leaves. Sinclair was arrested, but a judge refused a warrant and the case was dropped. We think, Mr. Sinclair, you've had your share of book advertising, the judge told him. That was that. But Sinclair had achieved his objectives, making a joke of Boston censorship and gaining a raft of free publicity for his book. He headed back home to California. When Sinclair stopped in New York City after his Boston sojourn, the first thing that caught his eye was a 4-foot-high stack of his books at a newsstand in Grand Central Station. That particular stack would be gone in a day, the clerk assured him. The books were selling like hotcakes, mostly to visitors from Boston who purchased copies before boarding the train for home. In the United States, sales of Oil jumped from a little over 2,000 during the first 3 months of 1927 to more than 6,000 a month during that summer, ultimately reaching 75,000. We authors are using America as our sales territory, and Boston is our advertising department, said Sinclair. It's a pretty amusing story. Now, the Watch and Ward censorship activities didn't just involve books and plays, and I would be remiss if I didn't say something about the Watch and Ward's campaign against burlesque and immoral dancing of all kinds. And I wanted to read to you also from my book one of its attacks on a precursor of burlesque, a dance called the kuda kuda, also known as the hoochie coochie or the coochie coochie. Anthony Comstock, who founded the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, had seen this dance at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, and he was none too pleased. He said, "I would sooner lay my 2 boys in their graves than they should look at some of the sights I saw yesterday." He told a newspaper reporter the entire World's Fair should be razed to the ground if the shows did not stop. The reaction was milder in Boston, but the Watch and Ward followed Comstock's lead, as was often the case. and they managed to get two Kuda dancers arrested, one named La Belle Frida, and the other a man named Phil Hamburg. So I write, when the two Kuda dancers were arraigned before Judge Frederick Eli in municipal court, the judge realized this was no ordinary case. Let's adjourn to the lobby, he suggested. The counsel for the dancers had told the judge that defense testimony would include the correct exhibition of the Kuda by the defendants. They needed a larger space than the judge's courtroom. Judge Eli agreed, and La Belle Frida retired to the privacy of an adjoining room to put on her tights. This is a legal proceeding, let me point out. The first witness was Albert Bustede, a watch and ward investigator. His evidence primarily consisted of a demonstration of the dance that he had seen the defendants perform. His was a pathetic performance, gyrating and moving his hips to simulate what he had viewed on stage. He did the best he could, wrote a Boston Globe reporter in a wry account of the hearing, but at best, his apparent object seemed to be to do some injury to his body. After he finished, he announced bravely, "That's a Kuda." However, Judge Eli clearly needed some firsthand evidence to make his decision. At this moment, Frida emerged in costume and began what could be described as a much more polished performance. The judge, more accustomed to the prosecution of petty thieves and Sunday blue law breakers, followed her movements closely from start to finish. When she was done and her male companion began to perform an apparently inferior version, the judge's attention seemed to wander. In the end, Judge Eli discoursed enthusiastically on the subject of dancing in general and proclaimed that he didn't see anything criminally wrong with the Kuda. He ordered Frida and her companion to be released. As the Globe reporter noted, this is the first time in the history of the court that a girl won her case by a dance in tights. Now, the Watch and Wards campaign against burlesque waxed and waned over many years. In the 1930s, the height of the Depression, they managed to get city officials to close down the legendary Old Howard, which was the Boston Burlesque Palace in Scully Square, just down the street. And Mayor Curley, who himself had banned the words damn, and hell from the stage in Boston in 1924, was a great fan of the Old Howard. But he gave in that time, and the Old Howard was shut for a month. And when it reopened, it was relatively tame, at least for a while. One of the dancers complained that we should have brought our red flannels. How effective the Watch and Wards campaign against burlesque and against the Old Howard over the years is questionable. Anne Corio, the famous burlesque queen, insisted in her book, This Was Burlesque, that the Old Howard management knew exactly who the Watch and Ward agents were, and they took precautions. And she tells this anecdote, which, believe it if you will, in which she said, "It was the ticket taker's job," wrote Corio, "to recognize every censor. And he never failed. As soon as the ticket taker saw a censor coming, he would press his foot on the pedal and a red light would go on. On stage," Corio noted, "a stripper might be giving her all for mankind, shimmying and grinding, with clothes flying in all directions, and the crowd yelling, 'Take it off.' But once the red light would start blinking, in the footlights, hips would cease grinding, clothes would appear as if by magic, and the musicians would break into a waltz." And she wrote, "By the time the censor reached the top of the stairs and looked down at the stage, he would see not the hip-swinging, hair-tossing, half-naked tigress, but a nun on a casual stroll through a most unlikely convent." And in fact, the Old Howard sort of looked, I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but it looked, I know I haven't either, because closed in the early 50s, I believe. But it looked like a church from the outside, sort of. It had this Gothic architecture. Anyway, by the 1950s, the Watch and Ward had abandoned its role as Boston's literary censor and moral watchdog, opting for a kinder, gentler persona. In 1957, focusing on combating gambling and organized crime, it changed its name to the New England Citizens Crime Commission. By the late 60s and early 70s, it had essentially disbanded, merging with organizations concerned with criminal justice reform. Now, even if the Watch and Ward wasn't responsible for every single act of censorship in Boston during its 70 years of existence, it was the inspiration and created the atmosphere for everything that happened over the years. The atmosphere that it helped create set back Boston in many ways. The Watch and Ward helped create a stultifying intellectual climate in which many of the city's artists and writers fled to New York and other places, from which they looked back on Boston for the rest of their lives with a mixture of amused vexation and amused regret, as the journalist Elmer Davis observed. But above all, in my view, the story of the Watch and Ward and censorship in Boston is a story of the dangerous effects of moralists of all stripes who tell people what to read, how to think, and how to act. The old genteel days of censorship in Boston are gone, but censorship cases continue to appear in high schools and libraries across the country. And that is something to keep in mind, particularly as we observe Banned Books Week. So that's it. I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
What were the legal bases of the actions that were brought against the society that led the proceedings before a judge? Were those laws, if any, ever repealed? And did the society morph from a Brahmin to an Irish character over time?
Very good question. The law, there were obscenity laws on the books, which the Watch and Ward helped enact back in the 1880s, and that was used for things like that dance. The Watch and Ward did somewhat more from a Brahmin organization. Every secretary of the organization was, and the secretary was like the most powerful figure, was a Protestant minister right up till 1940, when they actually had their first Catholic, although French Catholic, his name was Croteau, secretary. And he was somebody who had worked his way up the ranks as an investigator, doing a lot of gambling prosecutions and stuff like that. So he was really the first, but by that time it was becoming less Brahmin, certainly, than it had been. I mean, the Catholic Church itself got involved in censorship in the 1920s to some extent, because 1927 the Pope came out with this proclamation against warning bishops to crack down on immoral books. And I think some of those district attorneys who started taking things in hand themselves were Catholics. And I don't mean to label people by their religion, but I suspect there was some connection here. So it did morph. But the Watch and Ward, they would get a judge to issue a warrant and force the police in many cases to arrest people, even if the police didn't want to, for things like gambling and that kind of thing. And I've got a story in the book about how they broke up a poker game. This is, I think, 1898, maybe 1899. There were a bunch of workmen who were building South Station, and at lunchtime they had this poker game going on, and a Watch and Ward investigator saw it. He got the judge to issue a warrant, and sure enough, the police came and basically arrested all these poor guys for a poker game that involved 25 cents. But there were points during World War I, and I'll stop, that the Watch and Ward was raiding all sorts of brothels in a number of towns in Massachusetts, Gloucester, Taunton, Springfield, because of we were fighting the Germans, and there was fear of venereal disease, and the Watch and Ward kind of did a lot of these raids on their own with the help of the state police, kind of overcoming the local police forces who knew nothing about it. Sorry for such a long-winded answer. Yeah.
Yes, what was the interaction between the Watch and Ward Society and the Boston Public Library?
Well, she asked about the interaction between the Watch and Ward Society and the Boston Public Library. I think that, none of these books that the Watch and Ward banned could you find in the Boston Public Library, for sure, or these different district attorneys. So I don't really know too much about what went on in terms of their interaction, but clearly the Watch and Ward had a lot of power, and there was also a group of librarians that met and talked about censorship of books. And on the other hand, in the late 20s, it was librarians across the state who kind of led the fight to weaken the state's obscenity laws as involved books. So they were part of this, because at a certain point, you could ban a book legally if it had just one passage in it that was obscene. And, so almost that's why oil could be banned, because it had somebody going to a petting party, but, there were like 500 other pages in the book. And the law in 1930 was changed basically so you had to look at the book as a whole before it could be banned. So anyway, that was some of the agitation on that.
If there's one Bostonian, to my mind, that I imagine should have had a problem with the Watch and Ward Society and its precursors, and down to this day, it would be Edgar Allan Poe. And I wonder if in the course of your research you came across his name anywhere.
Well, actually, Poe wrote in the 1830s, right? And that was before the Watch and Ward. So they never banned any of his books, and I think he was long dead before the Watch and Ward came into prominence.
But where later, who was the headmaster? Peabody at the Groton School.
Yeah. And
when he
Peabody
said that, how he was so afraid that how do you put that bad books get in the hands of young people. If there was one writer that guys like him were afraid was addling the brains of our young people, it was Poe. But it never came up in the context.
I never found anything about that. Who knows? Maybe that he didn't allow books by Poe in the Groton School Library. I don't know.
I'm sorry, but really, the history, though, in relation to Poe and censorship in Boston is very interesting.
Is it? Yeah, I don't know anything much about it.
Well, just because it starts. Mother, Poe's mother and grandmother, were hired from the Covent Garden Theater by the manager of the Boston Theater, and so they emigrated to Boston. And in 1797, which was in the throes of this debate over the ban that you mentioned on theatrical productions. And so Poe's parents, right from the beginning, were up against that. And,
Yeah, no, that sounds interesting.
Did the membership change over the years, or?
I think it remained. What you mean? It certainly had its ups and downs, and
I missed the beginning of your talk. So, I don't know who founded it.
Well, it was founded by a lot of Protestant ministers, basically, in the 1870s, and sort of moralists. They were mostly Boston Brahmins. They were, this kind of the city's upper crust.
No particular person?
There were a few different ones. Well, Anthony Comstock came up from New York. He was the head of the New York Society. He kind of established the Boston one. But people like Edward Everett Hale, the Unitarian minister, was an early vice president. There was a man named Frederick Baylis Allen, who was the head of the board of directors of the Watch and Ward for many years. He was an early founder. So it was a lot of very distinguished Bostonians. Robert Treat Paine, you know who he was? He was a philanthropist, and he also started like the some anti-immigration organization, Immigration Restriction League. So he was an early founder, but it was definitely the old families and very distinguished Bostonians in the beginning.
Besides books and poker games and brothels, were they involved with critiquing artwork in the city?
Not so much. There was a big, what would you call it, controversy in Boston in the 1890s over this statue of a disciple of Bacchus,
Bacchanti.
Bacchanti, at the Boston Public Library. Mm-hmm. And it was a huge, I mean, it was like headlines in the newspaper every day, and there were different people wanted to get rid of it, but I was trying to find some Watching Award involvement in that.
And there wasn't.
And I couldn't. So, I was, perhaps if there were, they might have been operating behind the scenes. But yeah, they didn't really seem to, that didn't seem to be their main thing. I mean, it was sort of like, or even alcohol, they didn't really do anything. They sort of left that to other people. So yeah, the answer is not as far as I know.
Is that all right? Well, so I want to thank Neil Miller for coming and speaking today.